Well, welcome this afternoon. We have a real treat to have Andrew Revkin here with us this afternoon. And it's an especial privilege of mine to introduce him. Given the lunch we just had, you can be sure that we're going to have a very exciting conversation, not just a presentation, but a conversation, which will go back and forth and relies in great part on your questions as we get into that part of the session. Andrew Revkin is one of the most influential and respected reporters on the environment. He is the first two-time recipient of the National Academy's Communication Award, bestowed jointly by the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, and Institute of Medicine. This year, Revkin has been recognized for pioneering work in online environmental journalism in his New York Times .Earth blog. He's been reporting on the environment for the New York Times since 1995, a job that has taken him to the Arctic 3 times. He has written books and articles on the Amazon rainforest, global warming, and the once-and-future Arctic. He was senior editor of Discover, a staff writer for the Los Angeles Times, and senior writer at Science Digest. He reports on the global environment in print and on .Earth blog in the Times. He has spent a quarter century covering subjects ranging from Hurricane Katrina and the Asian tsunami to the assault on the Amazon and the troubled relationship of climate, science, and politics. In 2003, he became the first Times reporter to file stories and photos from the sea ice around the pole. He spearheaded a 3-part Times series and 1-hour documentary in 2005 on the transforming Arctic and another series, The Climate Divide, on uneven impacts of climate change and culture. Mr. Revkin has a biology degree from Brown and a master's degree in journalism from Columbia. He's now a senior fellow at Pace University's Academy for Applied Environmental Studies and has taught at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism and the Barnard College Center for Environmental Policy. In spare moments, he's a performing songwriter and a multi-instrumentalist who occasionally accompanies Pete Seeger at regional shows and plays in folk roots bands, Uncle Wade. Now, in looking at some of the things that he's written last night, it's very clear that we have here a prolific and a very profound writer who's focused on the environmental matters that are key to our future and their relationship to science, politics, and economics. He's had a profoundly significant role and responsibility of informing the public, affecting opinion and policy regarding matters ranging from the number 7 billion and carrying capacity to how matters are reported and how opinions are formed, and I think we're going to hear a bit about that as well. He's traveled, as I mentioned, to the Amazon, to the Arctic, and examined and written much about these things, where profound change sirens the need to pause, reflect, and change directions in what we do. In a review of Robert Brill's book, Who Speaks for Climate, he points out that the media is a central voice in a larger cacophony. The media is not a neutral observer, standing apart from cultural, economic, and political forces. Rather, media is a part of a larger field of interaction and is systematically shaped by and shapes our ongoing interactions. He hopes for and works toward fostering a critical consciousness regarding reporting on climate change and an analysis of unconscious ideological assumptions and political economic factors that influence media reporting on it, end quote. Mr. Revkin is concerned about how human-driven climate change may in fact derail progress in the world's least developed places, and he's been central to pointing out the glaring climate divide. I think I was perhaps struck most profoundly by his call to a young people to engage whatever their passions and predispositions might be, and to, quote, occupy the street you live on and work with your neighbors to make it a better place for all. Let's give him a warm welcome.
So it's really great to be here. Pace University and RPI are linked through the Hudson Valley Consortium of Environmental Consortium of Universities and Colleges. So we're really all part of that network. But what's really remarkable to me right now on the planet that wasn't there when I was your age, and that wasn't there certainly 100 years ago or further back in time, is the ability to shape and to share ideas has never been greater. And the ability for a good idea to change the world has never been greater. It used to take weeks for an idea to cross the Atlantic. Now it's all there right now anytime at the speed of electrons or photons, depending on your means of moving information. So this is a special moment. You're unbelievably lucky to be young right now, because this juncture between now and the middle of this century is a remarkable transition for the species and for the planet that we live on. And it's one that's a one-time deal in the history of a species. There have been plenty of life forms on this planet that in the past have changed the world. Cyanobacteria put the oxygen in the atmosphere that we're all relying on now as mammals. And they didn't know it, though. See, so cyanobacteria changed the world. But as far as we know, they didn't know that. So maybe they did in some deep way. We have the luxury and the challenge of becoming slowly aware of our planet-scale power. And that's really just been the last half century, maybe 75 years. In the 1930s, a Russian geochemist and a French theologian, interesting combination, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in Paris and Vladimir Vernadsky in Russia, coined the term noosphere. And I changed the spelling to noosphere. It was Noosphere. And what it was planet of the mind. Back then, it was sort of a vague concept that we were starting to sheath the world in intelligence. Now, this sheath that we've created can move bad ideas around just as much as it can move good ideas. Remember the 9/11 terrorists developed their concept in a very dispersed way. There were guys who went to flight school in Miami, and there were engineers who grew up in Saudi Arabia, and they came up with this diabolical way to turn transportation into a terror vehicle. And so and you could say, well, so that means we're just sort of where we were before. The potential for human activity to go bad or better is always there. I think that with this new capacity to get an idea for a better building design that can be done as cheaply as existing designs in a poor place, but be more robust in the face of earthquake threats, or more energy efficient, or you can think of 1,000 ways that knowledge exists that just doesn't exist uniformly that could make the world a better place. The upside potential to me swamps the downside. And that's why, up until about 5 years ago, I used to, when people said, well, Andy, are you like an optimist or a pessimist? Because we all have to kind of categorize ourselves. And I used to call myself a despairing optimist. Because when I was your age, when I was coming of age at Brown University in the 70s, I was reading a lot of the writings of René Dubos, D-U-B-O-S, who he used to write a column in the Rockefeller University newsletter called The Despairing Optimist. And I loved that notion because it basically encapsulated the idea you're looking at a pretty dire or challenging situation, but still diving in optimistically. And he also had a very rare, at that time, vantage point on environmental problems that he used to see the human-altered environment as not necessarily a bad thing. When traditional environmentalism was all about nature is over here and we're invading and wrecking nature, woe is us. And he had a more constructive notion that a landscape could be deeply modified by humans and still productive and still beautiful and still functional. And we live on a planet right now, we better get used to that reality, because any idea that it's nature over there and us over here kind of place has got to go away. There's a really important new book called Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris, M-A-R-R-I-S, a science writer. And this book is about the rambunctious nature of nature right now, that we have completely so upended and modified the system that we can't look at any place on the planet. As Bill McKibben wrote a long time ago, he wrote The End of Nature, Woe is Me. And she's written The End of Nature, not. We always were part of nature. Now nature is very much an artifact of our activity. But we have to get comfortable with that. We have to look more at ecosystem function than ecosystem restoration. Think of there's a whole body of science now called restoration ecology that's become kind of an atavism. It's sort of like, that's so 20th century, it's so 19th century actually, the idea that you could restore an ecosystem to some natural, beautiful state that existed before we got busy. You look at any place, Puerto Rico, that island, has more biodiversity than it had 500 years ago when Columbus came to the Caribbean. Much more. There are many more tree species, many more plant species generally. And it's because Puerto Rico historically has been kind of a disrupted ecosystem. Hurricanes come and go, boom, 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 crash through a forest, things fall down. And humans that have come in with all of our different critters and the plant seeds that came, or the ones that we planted intentionally. And that's all become, so Puerto Rico now is sort of the archetype of the rambunctious garden. It's a place that's just so modified, you can't think about restoration, you have to think about function. And so on the biological side, that's sort of where we're at. And that's a whole new field of science. You know, people are just starting to shift, the Park Service, I was just at a meeting in Florida where the National Park Service, if they used the traditional law to keep the Everglades National Park the way it is now, it's meaningless because there are so many invasive species there now that you're never going to bring it back to. Under park rules, theoretically, they have to extirpate every species that's new that came into the Everglades. But is that realistic? No, of course not. And now they include pythons from Burma, you know, from South Asia that are sort of settling in for the long haul in Florida. And monitor lizards are running rampant in parts of Florida. And there are some monkey species and all kinds of birds that kind of look at Florida and go, whoa, this is cool. And so if you're managing Florida's ecosystem into the future in this period of great biological change, you can't use the old rules. And it also means that it means we can maybe we can actually relax a little bit in that sense of, so much of environmentalism used to be driven by the woe is me or shame on you. It was usually one of those or both. Woe is me, things are bad, shame on you, Exxon, shame on you, whoever. And now it's not that simple. So you could say, well, that's a problem, or you could say that's an opportunity. Getting comfortable with the reality that Exxon, you can point to it and say, big bad organization, you know, you're terrible, you throw your money around in bad ways and politically, or you can say, well, where am I going to get my gas from to drive my car? Who's the villain? Exxon that's providing me with the oil that is in my Prius in the parking lot? Or is it me for needing the oil? And I'm with the me part, not, you know, and I've done plenty of investigative reporting in my time as a journalist pointing to bad practices by bad people. But right now, again, in this century, if you think that alone is going to get us a smooth ride, just identifying badness and punishing it, is that enough to have a smooth ride for heading toward 9 billion people on a finite planet? I don't think so. So that's where what I see in touring the campus this morning, at RPI, the stuff I'm trying to do at Pace University, there's a potential for a problem solving and idea sharing to happen at a scale that's never been possible, that it's possible now. And I'm going to give you a few illustrations. I'm going to avoid doing the PowerPoint because the lighting is a little tough. What I'm going to show, what I would show here will be online sometime soon. I haven't gotten a really good recorded version of it yet, but I will. So I'm just going to use words the old-fashioned way. And so when I look at Vernadsky and Teilhard de Chardin, the notion that I see is we're now building organically, not because someone needs to create a new thing. We're building the noosphere right now. And every time RPI establishes a laboratory that has outreach to companies and then reach across the campus to problem-solving students and faculty, that's the noosphere. Every time a student from here or Pace goes to another country and identifies a problem there that has a no-brainer solution and works to find a way to get that solution integrated into that place in a way that will take hold, that's the noosphere. And when universities collaborate so that a skill that's lacking on one campus but abundant on another is traded, that's this thing that I'm talking about. And I think, again, just think about we're at the early moment of recognizing the power of this, I think. I really only recognized it through the blogging work I've been doing, which started 4 years ago at the New York Times. I spent 25 years as a journalist just looking at stuff, taking notes on a pad, and then digesting it a little bit, asking a few people what they thought, and then typing some text. And maybe a photographer would shoot a picture, and it would go up on our primitive website in the 90s or into the printed form in the 80s. And then I'd kind of done my job. And now I see all the ways that that model runs up against limits. And there are impediments in the newsroom to accurately conveying issues like the ones that I think about every day: climate change, loss of biodiversity. You know, getting a story into the New York Times on something like the rambunctious garden, on restoration ecology. I did one in 2002 that really articulated that idea of getting comfortable with ecosystem function and not so worried about specific species. But that was like a real challenge. We had a special section of the New York Times in 2002 called Managing Planet Earth. If you actually Google for that phrase and my name, you'll see this big batch of stuff that we did in 2002. But again, that was like a one-time thing, boom, you know, and I thought, after doing this for a long time as a journalist, I thought, well, if I just keep trying to fight this fight of getting stories like that into this convention called the newspaper, and just think about the nightly news as being another example of what has to happen to a body of information to get to be a news report or on 60 Minutes is sometimes really, really frustrating, because you see all the nuance squeezed out. You see it become a caricature of what you, the reporter, really know. So I started blogging, and you know, and on the blog I've done lots of experiments, most of which just sort of flub along, and some actually are pretty interesting and could actually build out in bigger ways. One was I started annotating things, like President Bush gave a speech in sometime at the tail end of his last term on energy. And so I put it out on my blog, and I started saying, well, this is what it says, here's the line it says, and this is what it means. And then I realized, well, the community could do a better job of annotating it than I can. So I opened it up to readers I said, if you see some passage in this speech that really pisses you off, or that you really think, yeah, that's right, then make a comment, and then I can have like a linked annotation from your comment to the piece. It was very simple, crude. I did it in the crudest way, and then started to sort of normalize that. And I haven't done it lately because I just don't have the time to annotate everything. But I think about this, and I mentioned this at a lunch meeting with faculty. Suppose some document emerges in December in Durban at the next round of climate talks, which I don't think anything meaningful will emerge there. But suppose that document just gets put online, and that the different disciplines at RPI or at PACE dissect it. You know, basically, the business students could say, well, this is what it says about the value of trading forest credits. This is why that would be hard. Or this is where the weaknesses are, the loopholes. And the environmental students could do an analysis of what the actual greenhouse benefits would be if these proposals were carried out. You know, why can't the academic world use those kinds of real world experiences as a learning opportunity, an actually competitive way, you know, where the business school and the law school and the environmental science students are all looking at the same thing, some climate document, and dissecting it in a way that's out there on the web. And also it would be doing a public service, because it's out there for the public to then see beyond the veil of all that text what it actually means. So annotation of documents can be done as a collaborative, open learning experience and communication experience. All these posters here, as these projects grow, they can go online and be, whether there's a blog for a particular course, or each student generates, I think some of the students here do have a Tumblr accounts, whatever. That's a great part of making sure that discourse on that subject, whether it's artificial photosynthesis or building a water purification system for Haiti, the idea is not just sitting here, which is great here on campus, but also out in this noosphere. So, and at PACE I've launched a course this fall called Blogging a Better Planet, which it's not for environmental science students. For the moment, it's just for communication students, and I'm taking the students' predispositions, the things they're already interested in, whether it's celebrities or, in one case, the Caribbean, Virgin Islands. There's a student from the US Virgin Islands. And each student is building a blog that's around their interests and their passions, but that has some facet that's related to sustainability, or you know, environmental issues in the Caribbean, what island issues generally are so interesting. So they've just launched these blogs. There are 5 out of the 9 are launched. They're going to be launched in the next few weeks. And I'm not trying to change them all into environmentalists. I just trying to challenge them to think about some facet of what they're already interested in that relates to this question of how do we head toward roughly 9 billion people with the fewest regrets. So there's an opportunity within a learning experience to, again, to be out there, to be public, and to be engaged. And what I'm just teaching them, how to avoid really stupid things like calling someone a jerk or saying something libelous or copying material that you don't have the rights to. Once the basics are understood, then it's just get out there and experiment and connect. The other thing that I think not enough people realize, and I've only realized through using the web as a tool, as a learning tool, as a journalist, is the web is not just about output. It's about input. It's about building collaborative relationships. One of the other courses I'm co-teaching is a course for environmental science master's students. And what I've asked each student to try to do is to use the web to find someone working on the problem that their master's thesis is focused on, but in another country. And just to find the person. And it hasn't always worked. Not everybody's been able to do this. But it's a way for me to help them explore the possibility of, if you're working on a watershed ecosystem management project here, that could be just as relevant. Just think about in the world where there are other places with similar topography and geography and geology, and you can quickly find a place where those lessons will be applicable. And again, the Hudson Valley Consortium is 113 colleges and universities here around this one watershed that can build more relationships and do more collaborative work. I'm going to give you one more example from my own experience of how this noosphere can start to work in interesting ways. The other course I'm teaching at Pace is a documentary production course. And it's a course built around spring break. It was invented a decade ago by a professor. So the students every spring go somewhere they would want to go anyway. Like in this case, they've gone to Costa Rica, they've gone to the Netherlands, Italy, and they make a film about something while they're there. So they're learning, and they're getting in a little time on the beach or whatever, in a bar. And I came into the course to try to build a sustainability component into the course. And what we did last year, the first year, was there was a story in Belize that I always wanted to do. I'd never gotten to do it. I'd heard about this woman named Linda Thornton, who was an American who had moved to Belize in the 80s. She'd been in agriculture. She'd grown up, went to the University of Illinois, a classic Midwestern agriculture student, but was always fascinated with aquaculture because a professor convinced her to try to grow shrimp in Chicago in the 1980s in a closed environment, in tanks and all that stuff. And that project didn't kind of go very well. A lot of energy inputs, as you can imagine, keeping shrimp comfortable in Chicago. And so she then moved to Belize, and she created a successful model for shrimp farming there that's not the model. You've all heard, I'm sure, about the horrors of mangrove loss and what's happened in big chunks of Asia and parts of South America and Central America, where shrimp farming comes in, all the mangroves get cut down, they put in these pools, there's a lot of effluent flowing out, it wrecks the reefs, blah, blah, blah. Yes. And that's been in the media for how long? But the story you don't hear about in the conventional media is, oh, look, here's someone doing the other thing. They're doing a closed system. There are these big pools for the shrimp, but when they're ready to harvest the shrimp in one pool, they just let the water drain into the adjacent pool, harvest the shrimp, and then that water is reused. And they develop kind of a cocktail system where they're growing the food for the shrimp by managing the inputs into this water supply. They don't need antibiotics. All the other stuff that you hear about with sort of factory farming aren't there. And of course, there's still issues, including piracy. People come in with nets at night and steal the shrimp. But it was great, so I wanted to tell that story. So these students, me and the other professor, we went down there and we did this film. And so January, February is preparing. March, for 10 days is shoot, and then relax on the beach. And then April and May is produce the film, edit, and get it out there. And it's on YouTube now, and I blogged about it on .earth. But there were these gaps in the film. There were things that we needed to have. There were interviews with 2 scientists that we needed to have. One was in Washington, one was in Boulder, Colorado. We didn't have a budget. And remember, nobody has a budget now. right now. We're in a period of scant money for everything from basic R&D to making a film or whatever. So through my networks, I reached out to faculty at the University of Colorado and at George Washington University in DC. And I also found someone in the University of the Virgin Islands who I needed some content from. And they contributed stuff to this little documentary that we made. So we did a collaborative journalistic project where actually in the end it was 4 schools contributed components to what became a coherent story about shrimp farming. Now, and I see that as a model that could be expanded enormously. It could be either tackle a big subject like fracking or the future of natural gas in America. You can imagine if you got journalism or communication and environmental science programs around, maybe 10 around different parts of the country, representing different aspects of that issue to collaboratively produce output on that's relevant. So everybody throws in from their ability, doing interviews and on-the-scene reporting and analysis, some common pool, and then everybody draws out from that pool to produce something coherent and cogent that relates to their community's issue with natural gas or opportunity with natural gas. I think it's a mechanism and a potentiality that's huge that hasn't been really, and that could supplant or at least greatly enrich the discourse on things like energy in this country. That journalism will not do, conventional journalism will not do, and that gives universities a unique potential to dive in. So that's just one, you can think of how, you can see this kind of thing play out in so many different arenas. And it's efficient, it's largely a function of motivation and awareness, not of costs and like administrative bottom lines. Students will need, what I would love to see is a way for a student X in the chemistry department who wants to produce a little film about artificial photosynthesis, some aspect of the process, to reach out to student Y in graphic arts or in communication or journalism to help create a graphic, an animation of an idea. So, and for both to get credit. See, that's the other thing. There has to be innovation. We think of innovation too often as just the person working on the catalyst or the chemical reaction or some process. The innovations have to include innovations within our academic norms. How do you get professors in different departments to say, yeah, I'll make sure that student gets extra credit for working on the film for that student over there. I would love to see more brainstorming on ways to structure curricula or how we gauge success based on those kinds of things. And we could have great models for moving forward. Maybe I'll give you one last example. I don't know if it's worth trying to show, but let me see. One thing that does, there's so much potential on this planet right now for getting a good idea where it's needed and making a difference that I can't begin to describe how big that potential is. I want to show you one example. It actually involves my son, my 21-year-old son, who's a sophomore at Pace now. And don't worry about all this content. I'm fast forwarding. This just spells out what I've been saying to you. Oh, that's one other thing I really should show you. Oh yeah, here we go. Okay. Hold on. So I've written a ton about earthquakes and about unnecessary losses in earthquakes and about the potential that sits out there that's going to unfold in places like Istanbul, Turkey. And as you saw in Haiti, there are big cities on this planet, including the rest of Port-au-Prince that didn't fall down yet, is just as vulnerable, if not more so, to the next trembler in Turkey, in Haiti. And there are people, like at Purdue University, there's an engineer who came up with a very simple way to modify a very common building design. Almost every school I attended has this design where essentially, let's see if this will work. You can see, you can probably see the basic there. It's like a half wall between columns and then windows. That's a very common structure. I'm just going to repeat it in schools. And you can have multiple layers. The problem is, of course, that in an earthquake, those half walls are really dangerous. They tend to stress the column because they're only halfway up the column. When the columns start to go like this, they're held back at the base. And you get pancaking. These are all these pictures of pancake buildings. It collapses. This was just a week ago in Turkey. And So he's come up with, there's the weak spot. So he's come up, this is what tends to happen. My son did the animations. He's into After Effects, the software package. And then you can take, so Santiago Pujol, who's an engineer at Purdue, came up with a way to use the exact same quantity of bricks and glass and concrete and come up with a different design where you fill entirely the space between two columns and leave the next ones open. And he did the test, they have a test table there, just like there's one at University of Buffalo that I think some people here work with. And you end up with this, you can have a really great design, an open kind of classroom design, where just by changing the configuration of the materials, you can save lives, make a building that's more resilient in lateral shaking. So that, to me, says that that design needs to get out, you know, and you don't need language to show, you just show that video or even an improved version to someone building a building in Istanbul or anywhere. You can get across the idea. We're not talking about extra costs, we're just talking about new knowledge. And there, you can think in so many realms of those kinds of no-brainers that are out there now. There's a group called the Open Architecture Network, which is part of Architects for Humanity, I think, that's trying to build a way to do that with ideas for building designs and that kind of thing. So it's all there, and it's all there to be plucked by you at your age more than any generation previously. There's a guy at Cornell named Stuart Hart who I saw give a lecture a few years ago. And he started it by talking about this concept called chronocentrism, which is that every generation always thinks its time is special. You know, if you grew up in the Renaissance or if you grew up during World War II, that was the moment, that was the most special moment in the history of the human species. But to me, and I just wrote this again on .earth the other day, I think there's abundant evidence that this really is a unique juncture in our history as a species. You know, this is the first time after a 100,000-year kind of diddling along, boom, we've had this spike in our numbers and in our appetites. And it's going to change sometime in this century, either imposed upon us by limits from resources and the climate system, or shaped by us through ideas and through exchange and through innovation. We're going to be in a great transition. And it's an open question how that's going to play out. I tend to be very optimistic, much more optimistic than I was when I was a despairing optimist. Now I really am just optimistic. But mostly I'm engaged. And I think the thing that would be great to build into the norms of how people are taught from a young age is just how special this opportunity is right now, and how wonderfully gifted we are to have this thing called the web, and also the human web, not just the electron web, to make a difference. There's never been a better time to make a difference than the time you're coming of age, intellectually and other ways. So I'm happy to engage in a conversation with you further on these points, and also finding ways for us to partner up institutionally as well. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to ask a couple of key questions, but I would like all of you to queue up your questions, and when you have them, to come up to one of the mics and ask your question in the mic, because we're recording this session. But your optimism is infectious. It's been fantastic, both at lunch and here, to witness a kind of a desire, not only a desire, but a belief in an ability to make a difference and to make a change. We're at a point here in a university where we can either kind of follow or we can lead. And I guess the question is, what kinds of things can be done at the university at this age to begin to get in that leadership position, to see with confidence that one can really make a difference?
Well, I think here too, this is where students can make a big difference. I was at a meeting with, among other people, Ralph Ciceron, the president of the National Academy of Sciences, a year and a half ago in Washington, talking about universities and you know, what can you change and how. And I kind of mused to him. I said, so Ralph, if you could take your science dream team, you know, a bunch of Nobel Prize winners, and take them around like presidents of universities to demonstrate the possibilities of making a difference, wouldn't that be a good thing? And he said, no, it's not presidents of universities. He says it's tenured department chairs. He said that's the impediment. So what I see is being able to shape a little bit, and he also said to some extent death has to happen, meaning, you know, an actual generational change. You're not a chair, are you?
I am.
Oh, okay. But it looks like you've drunk the Kool-Aid. At any rate, I've seen instances where pressure from students, including applicants for universities, have made a difference in curriculum, including architecture. There's a guy named Ed Masria, who's sort of an evangelist for changing the way architecture is taught, so that I'm not sure, here I assume it's different, but many architecture schools just teach you design and how to build a building and how it works functionally and how it works aesthetically, but aren't so much into the full life cycle analysis, or it's not normal yet to think about the full design of a building and its relationship to the environment around it. And students now increasingly in architecture are demanding that. And so schools are having to feed that demand by shifting how they teach. And again, you probably know more about this than I do, but it struck me as an example. Now, I would love to see business schools particularly go through the same metamorphosis. This Occupy Wall Street phenomenon looks kind of fun and goofy, but what I would rather have students occupy Wall Street from within, starting with where they choose to go to business school, and then demanding of their professors that you teach every facet of Adam Smith, not just the pin factory part about efficiency, but also that Adam Smith wrote a whole nother book on moral sentiments and on the larger consequences of business decisions. And so how we teach stuff at an early age shapes whether you end up becoming a rapacious financier or whether you become a more fully shaped business person. But I think that's going to have to come from the students and prospective students in order to torque schools out of some of their norms. Otherwise, probably do have to wait for people to die off.
Well, do you think there's a way to short circuit that using the web, being engaged in creating your own networks?
I do think so. Yeah. Well, there's Rate My Professor, which anyone here ever use it? So I could see a kind of sustainability, you can have a conversation on the web about which schools are leading and lagging in terms of normalizing these issues that are bundled as sustainability into their curricula. So you can do that that's sharing best practices and maybe identifying and giving a little jab in the ribs to not best practices.
Mm-hmm. So the faculty you're urging to go out and to form networks with other faculty, with research groups. In other words, developing a university network rather than a university silo. I mean, even going beyond the departmental silos to understand something much larger.
Yeah,
can students invent that? Can that happen even from that level?
From the student level, that requires more faculty change because, as I said, it would be great for me to think that communication and science students would be able to collaborate organically on a project. Mm-hmm. And at PACE, we're big on project-based learning, just as clearly you are here. But finding ways to normalize, again, how you reward students for collaboration. I think in many schools, that's an issue still. Mm-hmm. So the faculty, and by the way, in my short time in academia, one thing I've learned at PACE is that physical interactions with other faculty really matter. I do a lot of, at PACE University, I'm not part of a department. I'm at this thing called the PACE Academy for Applied Environmental Studies, which was created by the president and provost a few years back to be kind of an interdisciplinary nudge and incent institution. And so I go around and try to meet faculty and just collaborate. That's what happened with this documentary course, which I think henceforth, at least as long as I'm there, will be essentially a sustainability filmmaking course. Mm-hmm. And it came about just through brainstorming between faculty with some shared interests. Now, and students there, I think some of the extracurricular activity or, working on the sustainability of the campus, collaborative relationships can build that can be interesting.
And they have here quite effectively. Are there some who have questions? Because we'd like you to kind of queue up and line up and ask some questions, and I'm sure we'll get a lively debate going here. And you can just come up and while I'm asking questions, and we'll move quickly from mine to yours, and it'll make it more interesting. Andy, you are both a biologist and a journalist.
I am not a biologist. I am a biology bachelor's degree graduate. And I worked in marine science for a number of summers through college, but I wouldn't say I'm a scientist.
And you've moved around, you have a curious mind, you look
Yeah.
across disciplines. To what extent do you recommend a path that involves multiple disciplines in the way one educates themselves?
When I was at Brown in the 70s, I was on a committee to examine the curriculum, because at Brown, they had an open curriculum. I think they still do, where you can basically take whatever courses you want. I had a roommate, my sophomore year roommate, he didn't take a course except physics, chemistry, and math, ever, I think. I mean, he had a room full of science fiction books, one whole wall, his whole side of the room was science fiction, and I think that's a problem. I think having some experience, and this is as an undergrad, having some experience outside of your discipline is vital, especially because, like, I've met many climate scientists who just get stuck in this mode of, why don't they get it? Why don't they get it? It's a big problem, it's a crisis, and they don't get it. And most of them never took a course in psychology or sociology, and when I got to know that community's work on issues like climate, they keep writing papers about why we're simply never going to get this problem, because it's such a bad fit for the way our mind is built and the way our social norms are built. And there's such a surprise factor in the hard science community, that wouldn't be there if they'd been more attuned to the social science, which I hate calling the softer sciences, but you know what I mean. And there would be a lot of avoided angst, I think, if there was more of that.
Please.
I'm probably one of those who will have to die. I'm not one of the young people you were talking to, but I think you know me. I'm Richard Pop.
Yeah. Hey, I don't think we ever met.
No, we never met.
Nice to meet you.
How do you deal with arrogant environmental geoscientists who are reticent to talk to you? Specifically, in my case, there are probably 3.5 environmental journalists in the U.S. that I will talk to.
Because? Tell me why.
Oh,
because you've been burned?
misreporting.
Because you've been burned?
Misreporting and lack of the facts of a science are not up for a vote.
I know. Well, what I tend to say to scientists facing that situation is, despite the pain, it's really good to interact and to not think of it. See, for too many scientists, what the pattern is, you're working, you come out with your consequential paper, the university puts out a press release or the journal, and there's your moment in the sun, and that's it. And even the norms of science publishing make it harder to do the right thing. See, what happens, there's embargoes. So scientists know that if they talk to a journalist about their ongoing body of work, that the journal will be really angry that the cat is out of the bag before the paper comes out in the journal. And so they tend not to build and engage a relationship with the journalists ahead of time. And of course, as you're saying, I'm an endangered species. There aren't a lot of specialized journalists in this realm anymore, which makes it even more important to reach out to your regional journalist community and build relationships, or have your university work on that, have open houses, so that when the paper comes out, that is the spotlight moment, there's some way of engagement, there's some preconditioning that happens so that there's less of a chance of them screwing up completely. And then when they do screw up completely, and they will, I've had more than a few scientists say to me that, oh, they'll never call that reporter back, or they would never even call to have the correction put in the paper, and that's the wrong instinct also, because journalism, this whole process on all these issues, whether it's PCBs or global warming and greenhouse gases, we're in this for the long haul. These are long-term issues. They're not one-story issues. So it's really important to correct errors, and it's really important, both of overstatement and understatement. And it's really important to try to build some kind of ongoing relationship, even when it's really painful. Oh, one thing I do say also is, if you're in an interview, don't think of it as a one-way street. The journalist isn't the only person who's allowed to ask questions. So at the tail end of an interview, say, okay, let's review. Do what you do in class, when you're standing in front of a board. You say, okay, now let's review. So with a journalist, you can do the same thing. So now let's review. What are you taking away from this? And pause. There's a magical 7-second pause. A human being cannot let 7 seconds go by without saying something. Try it sometime in any conversation. and let the journalist lay out for you his or her impressions of what you were saying. And then before they've left the room, you might have at least a little chance of avoiding some glaring error.
I'd like to get your thoughts on two different questions related. One is on the role of intellectual property on this idea of sharing the good of the world to save the environment and everything else. To me, there is a contradiction between the idea of making available technologies that are good for the world, broadly available to everyone, and at the same time pursuing aggressively patents and intellectual property to protect it. So there is a crush. That's one observation. I'd like your comments on that. The other one is, it seems to me like in North America and in the most developed countries of the world, we move consistently from waves of ideas throughout history. I mean, we go from the fight with Europe, the fight with Russia, the fight against radicalism in Islam. Now we seem to be engaged in this idea of that the planet is virtually falling apart and we need to save it. And that allows to move capital in great quantities to very focused objectives. So isn't it being more, I mean, there's a level of objectivity in that, but there's also a level of manipulation on it.
Yeah.
So where do you balance? What's your...
I was trying to hang on to your first thought, and about intellectual property versus open information. We were talking about this at lunch a little bit. I think there's categories where both will end up. There'll be a role for being careful about ideas and a role for open source solutions going forward. I think the gaps, the public good kinds of problems that are out there are large and won't be solved through that sort of closed system of how we develop new products and new technologies. And actually, I mentioned one at lunch, which was, and this is kind of, it's virtual, it's not a product per se, but it's a very useful tool. It's the hashtag. There's a guy who invented the hashtag. This is on Twitter. Anyone here have a Twitter account? I recommend it. Anyway, the hashtag is the pound sign and some phrase or some code. It could be RPI invent, as we were talking earlier. But that didn't just always exist. Twitter came of age for one purpose, kind of an instant messaging kind of thing. And then someone realized it really is this communal pool of ideas and commentary. So how do you organize that? There was a fire, the big forest fires in San Diego, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, and a young programmer working at Mozilla, the company that made the people that made Firefox, put out on Twitter a hashtag for, I think it was San Diego Fire or something. He said, let's organize this mess of information. And he invented the hashtag that moment. And he's now at Google, very successful young guy at Google. And he doesn't own it, he didn't make money off of it, but it really has proved to be an invaluable way to organize information on Twitter. And I can think of other examples of how that can play forward. And then we, in a mega scale, there are all these public good gaps in how we provide adequate energy to a growing world. That design for a building, should that be patented? And all it is a rearrangement of bricks. All I know is it's a good idea. It needs to get out to every place where we're building more structures in the next 30 years than have been built in all of human history. The metric is something like that. Mm-hmm. Just making sure that those basic principles are out there is a great thing. Whether that makes someone rich or not is another question. I think there'll be enough wealth creation for everybody. Now, in your other question, which was subtle enough that do you remember?
Attacking global issues which need integration, I think, would be one way of kind of summarizing it.
Say again? The balance between reality and manipulation. This idea that these are overarching themes. I've been trying very hard to maintain an open attitude toward the science on global warming and on what you would do about it if you were concerned. And I think there are some norms that have gotten out there that have been presumed to be a scientific point of consensus, 2 degrees, for example, or pick your number for CO2 concentrations. When you really look carefully at those numbers, they're all a function of values. How much do you value the future is largely wrapped up in how much you care about the potential for long-lasting climate change. So getting clearer about which things are science and which things are shaped by our predispositions, and where that's the most important factor is important to resolving all these disputes about things like global warming. And I do show, this might be worth showing. Hold on one second. Somewhere here I have a graph. I tried to do a rough visual that explains this. No, I went too far. Oh yeah, here we go. I don't know if you can get the idea. There's so many arguments. You have these really heated arguments about global warming is a hoax, it's a catastrophe. But I can tell you that 90% of the time, the people engaged in those arguments aren't even thinking about the same thing when they use the words global warming. The scientists, the fossil fuel representative, someone from China versus someone from the Maldives, everyone is coming at this with a different vision in their head of this thing called global warming. And so what I try to do is break this down into subcomponents. And this is where the uncomfortable realities come. More CO2, warming world is so well understood that even Michael Crichton, who wrote that very aggressive book about environmental fearmongers before he died a few years back, he agreed that greenhouse gases actually work. You know, they actually do trap heat in the atmosphere and make the world warmer than it would otherwise be. He just didn't agree that it was a crisis or the thing that would be the most important thing to attack in world problems. So that's non-controversial. It's a steep curve. It's a bell curve without hardly any bell. Greenhouse gases actually do work. So set that aside. And that's, most people who think about global warming's robustness, that's what they're talking about. The problem is that the aspects of this global warming problem that are most relevant to human societies remain durably uncertain, and where there's legitimate scientific disagreement. And this is the pace of sea level rise. In other words, how much seas will rise by 2100 is still very much undetermined. It's somewhere between, well, 2 feet and maybe 6. And maybe, but it's extremely unlikely. The high end of that range is, according to Stefan Rahmstorf, who's a very concerned person when it comes to global warming, is extremely unlikely. But even characterizing it as extremely unlikely is kind of hard to do, except that we know there's a certain, you can't move glaciers fast enough to go faster, to have more sea level rise than that by 2100. If Greenland's ice, if you just did everything possible to liberate that ice, you warmed Greenland a lot, there's a physical limit to how fast ice can flow from a ice sheet into the sea. So there is a sort of upper bound in theory. But the bottom line is, probabilistically, we still don't know whether it'll be 2 feet or 6 feet by 2100. What we do know robustly is that a warming world will have rising seas for centuries, if not millennia to come. That's like deeply archived in the geological history of the world. But that's not the thing that's going to drive policy. If you say, 10,000 years, seas are going to be 30 feet higher, that has no meaning to even a coastal country with big coastal exposure. So hurricanes actually has gotten more complicated. In 1988, when I first wrote my first big story on global warming, the current thesis, the thesis then was that you have up to a 50% rise in the power of hurricanes by mid-century, in this century. Now it's gotten much more complicated. On average, a storm is likelier to be in the powerful categories, but there are going to be fewer hurricanes in a warming world. So fewer storms, more in the higher categories. Does that meaningfully change how if you're a coastal mayor, does that change your thinking? Not really. Regional climate forecasting it hasn't gotten any better, and scientists engaged in that modeling say it's not going to get better. You could give them many billions of dollars more, better computers, but the fundamental limits on modeling constrain how well we're going to understand the climate of a particular place 50 years or 100 years from now. And finally, the one that's there in small letters is warming from doubled CO2. This is what's called the sensitivity of the climate system. That's been roughly the same range, 2 to 6 degrees centigrade, basically from something probably manageable to something catastrophic, has been that same range since at least the 70s, when this issue was first floating seriously in the science community. So a lot of intellectual inquiry, not a lot of change. That says to me that's not going to be changing soon. So once you've delineated the architecture of the problem, then you can have a meaning discussion or debate about it. And by the way, that's just the problem. That's not about the solutions. The policy side, what do you do about it? How much do you focus on deployment of today's technologies versus innovation of the next generation? Those issues are robust and deeply argued, including on my blog. Joe Rahm the other day, from a very liberal, aggressive environmental blog, said I had a Charlie Sheen moment because I quoted some people, including Nate Lewis, who will be here tomorrow, talking about artificial photosynthesis, saying that you can't do it all with today's technology. Even if you deployed and deployed and deployed at the fastest possible pace you could imagine, you still have to do a ton of innovation that's not really happening right now. So that's a whole other set of questions. But again, just to recap, making sure if you're having an argument, make sure you know what you're arguing about, and then you can have a constructive argument. And you have a question.
My name is Lauren Menard. I'm a sophomore here at RPI. And you were speaking earlier of how we see ourselves as humans separated from nature and how that should disappear eventually. And I was actually we were talking about that in a class called Environment and Society. And what I've realized about the integrated sustainability ideas into the design world here at RPI, like in the curriculum, is that designing to fix the world in a sustainable way is actually still seeing ourselves as disconnected from the environment, as we need to protect this different entity. But how do you believe that we can go about learning and designing in a way that we see ourselves as the same as nature and the environment?
Well, it has to come it's a good question. It has to come early in students' careers. I mean, from the time they're in 4th grade, really, if not earlier. And I guess it's an open question in a way. I just would like to see more storytelling that's less traditional. I think there's a way right now to look at the landscapes around us, make sure the students understand the normalcy of invasiveness, that this Hudson Valley is not what it was. Oh, there was a really good book created a few years ago called Manahata by a guy who was at the World Wildlife Conservation Society. That was basically, he did a pretty thorough study of the geology of Manhattan Island and the surrounding area to build a pretty robust portrait of what the ecosystems were like before contact, before the white invasion. And it's a beautiful, and the visualizations are fantastic. You see Manhattan just as an island. You don't see the landfill, you don't see all the changes that occurred. And just having that sense of what was there once and what's there now, I think is really kind of fascinating and gives you a sense of the inevitability to some extent of human changes to landscapes. And then just even within cities, Thoreau, who's best known for his writing about the wonderful nature of nature, he also wrote about the importance of what he called in one essay, the swamp at the edge of town. So making sure that even an urban kid knows that there's little pockets of fascinating nature in any city that are just as interesting and just as valuable a learning tool as going to the Rocky Mountains. That's something that's important too. So again, as I was saying with Adam Smith, teaching the full Thoreau would be equally valuable to teaching the full Adam Smith.
To bring it back to something we were discussing earlier regarding education. Now, I understand and value the internet, right, as a source of communication between people. But from your own experience, how do you motivate the generation to get involved and to become aware about these things? And you have your blog, and many people follow it. But
yeah,
what steps did you take to popularize your blog and just to spread your information?
You know, I'm going to co-opt your question and I don't want to talk so much about what I've done. The blog has readership all around the world. It's mostly, I think 90% the US and Europe and Australia, chunks of Asia. But the potential to make connections and to build meaningful relationships is just so huge. And one of the other things I point to is, this is also worth showing rather than telling. Sorry about all this. Let me go to a different, this will be quicker. I'm going to just show you an example of how this works. It's better. Oh yeah, here. Go to the website Atlantic Rising if you can. I blogged on it, but so just go to atlanticrising.org. It's a British NGO. It's tiny. I think it's like 5 people. And what they've done is they've gone around the Atlantic perimeter to communities and done workshops with students, mostly elementary, maybe high school. And so we're talking from like Ghana to Scotland to Nantucket. And they basically just talk about sea level rise, and they learn about sea level rise. They go to the coast and they do exercises like trying to understand what 3 feet of sea level rise looks like. So you can kind of jump forward in time. And these are students, they used surveyors' equipment to get an idea of their new shoreline. So that's one thing. But then what they do is they've also, in many cases, they've built these relationships between schools using Skype and other means. There's a school in Scotland that's been in touch with a school in Ghana, and they kind of are co-learning about coastal issues as they relate to coastal communities and sea level rise. And it's not judgmental. It's not like a scary woe is me kind of thing. It's just a learning exercise on what it means to live on a coast that's vulnerable to change and that's going to be facing a lot of change. So that's doable at no cost. Skype is free. It still is free. And it's a way where communities sharing common geography can kind of learn together. That's just one. And then, as I've pointed out many times, there's, let me see, the other thing, this really came to me in 2009 when I was in Istanbul doing an article on earthquake risk. And I was running around many sections of Istanbul that are off the tourist track. I was in a really poor neighborhood where these are families that don't own computers or whatever. Even at the schools, they didn't have computers. But they have community centers that had computers. And these kids that I met there, they were running up to hold on. So these kids were kind of come up to, every time a reporter with like a pad and a camera goes to some weird place, kids come up to you and want to know where you're from. And even if they don't speak the language, they'll say like American or whatever. The kids in this poor part of Istanbul came up to me saying, Facebook? I kid you not. And that really struck me. I didn't realize it at the time, but like that night I went, oh my God. And I went into their community center, and these kids, they had a bank of about 10 computers. They're mostly playing games. And some of them were playing Farmville. And my kid back home at that time was still playing some Farmville. And I thought, okay, so it's just a matter of seconds by internet time before kids in Turkey and kids in America can be playing Farmville together with a translation interface, so the language is not an issue. You know that's coming. It's already there on many aspects of Google now. And so after I left, a bunch of these kids are now my friends on Facebook. And so you say, okay, that means they're just posting their things about Kardashian or whatever, the latest wedding, whatever. But kids who play together can then start to learn together. I think having that exposure gives you the potential for building relationships. A little tweaking, like I said earlier, can go a long way. You know, the games that they play, there's a game called Minecraft. I don't know if anyone here knows about it. Yeah, see? Engineers probably really love Minecraft. Yes? Yeah. It's pretty cool. It is really cool. And, building things. Right. It's building things and then things kind of breaking. You're being challenged. And then Notch, the guy who developed Minecraft, it's an open source game. It's an indie game. The guy in Sweden, I think, he keeps adding stuff. Like he added weather maybe a year or two ago. Yeah, biomes. And so I want him to add earthquakes. And I want him to add structural integrity so that when you build a building, it has to hew to actual gravity, like instead of just being able to build. And I've been trying to interview, if you know, wait, I've been trying to get in touch with him. I've pinged him by Tumblr and Twitter a few times, and I want to interview him about adding elements that just subtly add some resilience thinking, so that kids, as they're building their buildings collaboratively, are thinking about resilient structures and that kind of thing. So the potential, again, is unmatched. There's a game development company here, right? The education thing?
Well, we have a program, and I think the chair is here. Yes.
Well, we should, I'd love to talk to you about, okay. What does that say? Oh, okay, good.
Okay.
Oh, we have, all right. Well, and I'm going to show you one last thing maybe before we wrap up. I'm assuming we're close to time. And this has come up in the discussions with faculty here already. Where is it? It's about learning by breaking stuff, learning through failure.
As he's looking, if there's any final questions, take a risk.
Yeah.
Get up and ask that question.
Yeah, make a mistake.
Make a mistake. I think that's been part of the lesson here.
Shoot, where is it? So ask away.
I wanted to go back to, as you were talking about the scientists who were unable to communicate because of lack of psychology classes, I was looking at our logo behind you where it says knowledge and thoroughness, and I was thinking thoroughness is not really the problem for a scientist usually.
Yeah.
It's usually delivery.
Yeah.
And one of the things I try to do in my classes is teach that no matter how great an idea you may have, however great a story you may have to tell, if you don't know how to deliver it properly, it's like the tree falling in the forest when there's nobody around.
Right.
And that I'm in an institution that has Polytechnic in the title, so I realize that's an issue to begin with. And I'm in a school within that institution, which is the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences School.
Yeah.
And I'm within a department within that school, which is Language, Literature, and Communication, at a school where we have no language. We have two literature classes, and the communication isn't really teaching people to communicate.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that it seems like more than getting them to take sociology and psychology, it might be helpful to actually teach them how to deliver message.
Yeah, well,
and get it to other people, and to get it out there without the proselytizing and what we see in media now, which is everybody has an opinion instead of just saying, here's some facts.
Well, again, this is the power of community comes in here. This is where, and I don't mean to disparage if you feel your program itself is too small and insignificant. The program within, like the Hudson Valley colleges and universities, there's lots of hubs within that for a lot of capacity in the storytelling realm. And having some normalization of having the science students and maybe faculty working collaboratively to tell their story. The labs here all have great stories to tell. The ones I toured this morning, normalizing that each lab should have a blog. Not that they're maintaining it every day, but that at least seasonally, the project that's, and I know there's the IP issues and non-disclosure stuff, but there's, even with that, so you have your curtain, but outside of that curtain, there can be plenty of communication that happens that conveys the story of the value of having the kind of relationship that RPI has with companies. Without revealing the details of what's coming through that, you can certainly tell the story of that process and how you build trust and how you experiment and how the value is added to each and how you move forward. So whether within this campus or within the larger community of campuses around here, there's ways to do that. And then just demonstrating the capacity becomes, then people get comfortable with it. Instead of that, the old, Richard is right about the old model of the journalist coming in and everyone going, oh my God, run for cover. There has to be a way around that. And I think part of that is just getting comfortable with storytelling. And also, by the way, as I said, I think earlier, just using these communication pipelines to find collaboration in your learning is a great thing. So that you as a student or a team doing a project, making sure if you're working on a Haiti problem that some other school is working on, collaborate with them. You know, instead of everyone being independently reinventing the wheel. Now, I did want to mention, I want to show one last video. This is about getting comfortable with breaking stuff. And this is probably one of the hardest things because it's about our education system. And it's just, you know, my wife, I can't remember if I mentioned here or just at lunch. My wife was a science teacher. She isn't now, but for a long time. And they did this classic exercise that many of you probably did as a kid, where you build a bridge out of balsa wood and then you add weight until you break it. And it's like a competition. But what they did, she and her co-teacher, he came up with the idea of the students having to do it, this is middle school, on a budget. So they had a virtual budget, and they had to buy their balsa wood, you know, which kinds of pieces, and how much of each. And they were assessed on the cost and benefit. In other words, if you built the strongest bridge in the world, but it cost a shitload of money, would never actually happen in the real world, then that cut against your grade. So you had to balance costs and benefits, kind of like real life. And it's the infectious nature of the learning that results is what's so cool. And I put this video on my blog a while back. You know, not every one of those kids is going to become an engineer, but some of them probably, because of that exercise, would think about engineering or some science or communication or something. That, just the infectious nature, their cheers and stuff is just so rare and so possible. Did you have a last question? Or? Oh, yeah.
We have a couple more, I think, or one more.
So you spoke of using your personal networks in your New York Times blog, but not everyone has access to those to create social networks, that is. Do you have any examples of people using more public platforms, such as Facebook or Reddit, to create these sort of successful social networks?
I think it's happening. They're just right here, what was Engineers for something?
For a sustainable world?
Yeah, Engineers for a Sustainable World. Yeah, the Engineers Beyond Borders, Architects for Humanity, those are the networks. They're happening, and it'd be great to have it become more normalized so that every engineer, I did a piece on my blog a while back that I got chided for a little bit. It was ethical engineering, not an oxymoron. Of course, because every engineer feels he or she is ethical. But you know what I was getting at was engineering with a broader purpose, with a higher sense of what the problem is. That's all happening. And it doesn't, see, that's the thing that's cool about this noosphere-ish concept. I used to think I'd have to build something, like a new website to make this happen, or a competitor for Wikipedia. But I don't think you need that. I think it's already there. It just needs to be maybe a little more organization, a little more sense of building motivation into how students think and develop their careers.
And a wrap-up question.
Hello, my name's Kyle Monahan. I'm a senior here at RPI. And throughout my education, either I gleaned it or it was told to me, there's kind of this narrative that says that there's a dichotomy between a rigorous and in-depth curricula and a kind of interdisciplinary, broader curricula. And so with your comments today, I kind of began to think that maybe that line isn't as pure and as discrete as it was told to me. How do you think that the changes in electronic communication that you've mentioned, this noosphere, and the changes in the social dynamic of the youth today kind of play into that line? And do you think it's being blurred, or do you think it's still concrete? Because the thing that gets me is that, you know, I like science a lot, I really do, and I really like data, and I think it tells a story. And I think a lot of times people move past that story, and it worries me to lose rigor in sight of breadth. At the same time, I know you need that breadth to understand the rigor.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, this is, you know, I think you can have both. Someone at lunch, one of the faculty from the sociology group here, talked about T-shaped people. You know, where you have breadth and depth in one field. There aren't a lot of those, or it's hard to be that. But it's more possible than ever, perhaps. But I think what we have is T-shaped communities, or like what would be like rake-shaped communities, where there's this.
And then, because then it's all about meshing the skill sets or motivations of one with another, making sure there's exposure to other people, the other tool sets, so you can have them in the same room. And again, you do this here through these multidisciplinary team approaches to problem solving. So I think all the architecture is there, and I think this is an articulation of that, actually. And President Jackson is certainly a big fan of this. So I think it's there. And I don't think we all have to be T-shaped, but if we live in a rake-shaped world where the horizontal part is very slippery, in other words, there's a lot of crosstalk, a lot of things moving laterally, and then coming out of the depth you have in the different fields where needed, the possibilities are really endless. A book that articulates aspects of this, I think, is really a must-read, is Matt Ridley's book, The Rational Optimist, which I have problems with some of Ridley's, I have problems with everything, including some of my own attitudes. But it's an amazing book in laying out just the potential for this slipperiness of the web, not just the web, but other communications networks of exchange, including economic exchange, making the world a better place. So it's really, that's why I think this is a hang on to your seat time, not so much a woe is me or a hooray time. But I do think overall I'm optimistic.
You've brought it full circle to optimism, and I think we can have some here if we'll learn to.
I just wanted to, I did want to show you one last illustration.
Good.
You can have rigor, and you can have data, and you can have meaning. Like, whoop. So, yeah, here we go. Whoa, no. That's a whole other thing. So, there's the whole thing about showing and telling. And so the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure, I could tell you how many million square cubic kilometers that is. I don't actually know the number right now. I could tell you the number, or I could show you the number. There's nothing fuzzy or artistic about this image at all. That is the volume of the atmosphere at sea level pressure. If all the air in the atmosphere from the stratosphere down was at sea level pressure, that's what it is. So to me, that's a great starting point for any discussion of how we head toward 9 billion people, sharing that volume. This is a good starting point. And I think it shows you, this was done by a science illustrator in England named Adam Neiman, who is someone who should be in the room when, like, the IPCC is coming out with its next report. It'd be great to have the Adam Neimans of the world working with them on how to translate all that data into something more meaningful. So that's possible too. You can have rigor and meaning. I mean, meaning outside of the scientific meaning.
Andy, thank you very much, and there's a reception to follow.
Great. Thank you.